the wealthiest man in Rome, throat forced open, as enemies pour liquid gold down his gullet. The metal sears through flesh. Smoke rises from his mouth. His screams die in bubbling, molten agony. This isn't medieval fantasy. This is history. And the man dying this unspeakable death, he wanted to be greater than Caesar himself. Marcus Licinius Crassus didn't just die. He was transformed into a monument of mockery, a golden corpse whose execution would echo through the centuries as the ultimate price of greed. But before we witness that final, horrific moment, we need to understand the man who thought himself untouchable and the catastrophic chain of decisions that led Rome's richest citizen to the most humiliating death in ancient history. This is the story of how unlimited wealth, unchecked ambition, and hunger for military glory converged into one of the most brutal executions ever recorded. The man who bought Rome. He didn't just want wealth. He wanted to own the very soul of the Republic. Marcus Licinius Crassus wasn't born into the highest echelons of Roman nobility, but he understood something fundamental about power. Everything has a price, and the man who controls the money controls everything else. By the time he reached middle age, Crassus had accumulated a fortune estimated at 200 million sesterces, roughly equivalent to $2 billion today. But raw numbers don't capture the reality of his dominance. He didn't just have money. He had Rome by the throat. His path to wealth was ruthless genius. During Sulla's proscriptions, he bought executed men's properties at bargain prices. His true innovation was Rome's first private fire brigade. When flames engulfed an apartment block in the crowded insulae of Rome, Crassus would arrive with his team of 500 trained slaves. His offer was simple: sell me your burning property for a fraction of its worth, or watch it turn to ash. Most sold. He would then extinguish the flames and add another property to his growing portfolio. He owned thousands of slaves trained as miners, architects, and accountants managing his financial empire. He loaned money to nearly everyone who mattered, from senators to generals. Even Julius Caesar owed him deeply. Without Crassus's backing, Caesar's political career would have died before it began. Yet Crassus lived with gnawing frustration. Rome worshipped military glory above all else. Pompey the Great had conquered the East. Caesar was carving out Gaul. Both had celebrated triumphs, sacred processions where victorious generals were treated as living gods. Crassus had none of this. His one military achievement, the brutal suppression of Spartacus's slave revolt, was impressive but tainted. He had crucified 6,000 slaves along the Appian Way, turning the road into a corridor of the dead. But Pompey had stolen the glory, claiming credit for the final victory. Rome remembered Pompey as the hero who ended the slave war. Crassus seethed with resentment. Money, he discovered, couldn't buy the one thing he craved most: respect. He could purchase senators, fund armies, and control Rome's economy, but he couldn't purchase the immortality that came with military conquest. The merchants praised his wealth. The nobles tolerated his influence. But no one sang songs about the man who got rich from burning buildings and dead men's estates. So Crassus made a fatal decision. He would use his wealth to purchase eternal military glory. He would lead legions into the East, return with treasure and triumph, and finally stand equal to Pompey and Caesar. He would become legend. What he became instead was a cautionary tale written in blood and gold. The road to perdition. The Parthian Empire wasn't just another enemy. It was Rome's nightmare made flesh. In 55 BCE, Crassus became governor of Syria and immediately planned his invasion of the Parthian Empire, a vast realm stretching from the borders of Rome's eastern provinces to the edges of India. Where Rome built disciplined legions, Parthia rode chaos. Their cataphracts were armored cavalry that charged like iron tsunamis, while horse archers mastered the Parthian shot, firing arrows backward while retreating at full gallop. They didn't stand and fight. They bled enemies slowly across impossible distances. Crassus knew this. His advisors warned him. Even the omens turned against him. Crassus dismissed it all. He saw only the wealth of Parthian cities, the legendary treasuries of Babylon and Seleucia, the trade routes carrying silk and spices from the distant east. He saw his triumph. He assembled 7 legions, 40,000 infantry plus cavalry. His son Publius joined him, fresh from serving under Caesar in Gaul. The invasion began in 54 BCE. Crassus took several Parthian cities easily and grew confident. In spring 53 BCE, he rejected the Armenian king's offer of 10,000 cataphracts and a mountain route that would neutralize Parthian cavalry. Mountains meant no glory. Crassus wanted the direct desert route that would demonstrate Roman superiority. His guide, secretly in Parthian employ, led him away from water sources, deep into scorched plains where heat shimmered and the horizon blurred. The legions marched in traditional square formation, weighed down by armor as temperatures soared. Dust caked their throats. Thirst became constant, and somewhere beyond the wavering horizon, the Parthians watched and waited. General Surena, commander of Parthian forces, had no intention of meeting this Roman army in direct combat. He understood what Crassus did not, that in the desert, the one who controls mobility controls the battle. Surena fielded only about 10,000 men, mostly cavalry. But he had something else, a massive camel train carrying tens of thousands of arrows. He would not need to break the Roman square. He would simply bleed it to death. As Crassus's legions marched deeper into the wasteland, they saw nothing but empty landscape. Then, on a fateful day near the town of CARRHAE, the Parthians revealed themselves. The nightmare had only just begun. CARRHAE, where eagles fell. The Parthians appeared with massive kettle drums that rumbled across the desert, drowning out orders and making hearts race. Then they tore away plain coverings, revealing polished armor and silk banners in brilliant reds and golds that blazed in the sunlight. The exhausted Romans squinted into this dazzling display. Parthian horse archers circled the Roman formation just beyond javelin range, loosing continuous arrow waves. The Romans formed testudo, overlapping shields creating a mobile shell. But Parthian composite bows generated tremendous force. Their arrows punched through Roman shields as if they were cloth. They penetrated armor. They found gaps in the testudo and dropped soldiers who thought themselves protected. The Romans couldn't advance. The horse archers simply retreated, maintaining their deadly distance. They couldn't retreat. Crassus had committed to battle. They could only stand and bleed. Young Publius Crassus led a cavalry charge to break the stalemate. It was exactly what Surena wanted. The Parthian archers fled, drawing Publius away from the main force. Then the trap closed. Cataphracts appeared behind the fleeing archers. Publius's force, separated and exhausted, was surrounded and slaughtered. Rather than be captured, Publius ordered his shield-bearer to kill him. The young man who had been Rome's brightest military prospect died in the dust, his body mutilated by the victorious Parthians. Surena mounted Publius's severed head on a spear. When the Parthians returned with the head held high, Marcus Crassus nearly collapsed. Roman discipline shattered. The arrow storm continued as camel trains brought endless ammunition. Night fell like mercy. The Parthians withdrew, allowing the Romans a few hours of darkness to tend their wounds and face the reality of their situation. They had lost thousands. They had no cavalry. They had no hope of victory. Crassus, against the advice of his officers, refused to attempt a night retreat. Instead, he waited until dawn, giving Surena time to position his forces for the slaughter. The retreat, when it finally came, was a chaotic rout. The Roman army fragmented. Some units made it to the city of CARRHAE. Others scattered into the desert. Thousands of wounded were abandoned where they fell, left to die of thirst or be captured by the Parthians. The legendary Roman eagles, the sacred standards that represented Roman honor and had never been surrendered in living memory, were lost in the disaster. Of the 40,000 men who marched into Parthia, approximately 20,000 died. Another 10,000 were captured and marched east into Parthian slavery. The survivors limped back toward Syria, broken and haunted. But Marcus Licinius Crassus would not be among them. The price of gold. In the aftermath of CARRHAE, Crassus managed to reach the relative safety of the Armenian hills with a portion of his remaining forces. The Parthians pursued, but offered negotiations. CARRHAE sent messages proposing a meeting to discuss terms for a Roman withdrawal. It was likely a trap. Crassus knew it was likely a trap. His officers begged him not to go, but what choice remained? His army was shattered. His son was dead. His grand conquest had become the most humiliating Roman defeat in generations. Perhaps, in his desperation, Crassus convinced himself that his wealth still mattered, that he could negotiate a ransom, that money could still solve what military might could not. The meeting was arranged on neutral ground between the armies. CARRHAE appeared with a magnificent white horse, a gift, he claimed, for Crassus to ride to the negotiating site. The symbolism was clear: we honor you still as a worthy commander. It was theater, a careful performance designed to lower Roman defenses. As Crassus and his officers approached the Parthian position, the atmosphere shifted. What began as a diplomatic meeting degraded into confusion, then confrontation. Parthian guards pressed closer. Hands reached for weapons. One of Crassus's officers drew his sword to protect his commander. The Parthians responded instantly, claiming Roman treachery. In the violence that followed, Crassus was seized and his officers cut down. The wealthiest man in Rome was dragged from his horse and held in the dirt. The Parthians understood exactly who Marcus Licinius Crassus was. Rome's invasion was driven by one man's greed, his desperate need to transform money into military glory. CARRHAE understood this. The Parthian nobles understood this, and they decided that Crassus's death should reflect the obsession that had brought him to their desert. They melted gold. Historical accounts describe how, after Crassus's execution, the Parthians poured molten gold into his mouth. Whether this happened to a living man or his corpse, the message was eternal. Here is the gold you craved, Roman. Drink deep. Gold melts at 164 degrees Celsius. The metal would sear flesh on contact, boiling blood, producing smoke and burning tissue. If Crassus was conscious, his screams would die as his throat was destroyed from within. The gold would solidify in his esophagus, a golden tumor where once was life. His body was never returned. No funeral rites were performed. Marcus Licinius Crassus simply disappeared into the desert, remembered only for the manner of his dying. The golden throat became instant legend, too perfect, too symbolic to forget. The man who lived for gold died by gold. The wealthiest man in Rome died choking on his own ambition, transformed into a monument to the very greed that drove him into the desert. 7 legions destroyed, 20,000 dead, Roman eagles lost, and at the center, a severed head filled with gold, passed around a banquet hall as entertainment. This is what remains of Marcus Licinius Crassus, not statues or temples, not triumph or glory, but a cautionary tale about the man who had everything and died trying to have more. The gold didn't make him immortal, it made him infamous. And somewhere in the desert sands of Mesopotamia, if you listen carefully to the wind, you might still hear the echo of molten metal meeting flesh, and the final, bubbling scream of a man who discovered too late that some thirsts can never be satisfied. This is the price of greed. This is the cost of glory. This is what happens when you try to drink from a cup made of gold, and it burns all the way down.